Welcome to this explainer. Today we are diving into a truly fascinating topic, the environmental roots of Western political thought. We're going to use the historical analysis from M. Judd Harman's work, Political Thought, from Plato to the present, to unpack exactly how the physical and social landscapes of ancient Greece forged the absolute bedrock ideas of our civilization. It's an incredible look at how where you are literally dictates how you think.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at the roots of Greek philosophy, the geography of the city-state, Athens versus Sparta, the fabric of society, the meaning of citizenship, and we'll wrap it up with the philosopher's crucible. Let's get into it.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the roots of Greek philosophy.
You know, it's so easy to picture brilliant guys like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle just sitting in a void, right? Like they're just plucking transcendent truths out of the ether. But Harman's text reminds us that they absolutely did not formulate their ideas in a vacuum, not even close. Their political philosophies were deeply, inextricably tied to the very specific society they lived in. I mean, even when a massive thinker like Plato was harshly criticizing Athenian democracy, the very premises of his attack, the actual ideas he was wrestling with, were entirely supplied by the city-state itself.
Moving on to Section 2, geography of the city-state.
So we usually translate the word polis as just city-state, but honestly, that doesn't really do it justice. The polis was this highly personal, deeply intimate community. It was a unified defense system, a social hub, and a political center all rolled into one. It's vastly different from the massive, kind of impersonal modern nation-states we're used to today. Back then, you didn't just live in a polis, you belonged to it. It was your whole world.
And the crazy part? The Greeks didn't just sit down one day and consciously decide, hey, let's create a city-state system. They grew into it completely naturally. And geography was the ultimate deciding factor here. The rugged mountains and the sea basically carved Greece up into these narrow, isolated valleys. Because the topography made traveling so incredibly difficult, these communities just naturally developed in isolation. They built these fortified acropolises, basically big strongholds on high ground for defense, but pretty quickly, those spots became the social and recreational hubs for everyone in the valley. They were practically forced by the landscape to develop these intensely localized, tightly knit groups.
Next up, Section 3, Athens versus Sparta. This is a classic historical juxtaposition. Take Athens, for example. They were out there experimenting with democracy, pursuing the good life, and acting as the absolute cultural and educational center of the ancient world. Sparta, on the other hand, well, they completely scorned all that societal laxity. They had a singular, intense militaristic focus, living the cold, harsh, and totally comfortless life of the barracks. And what was the historical result of this? While Sparta's legacy pretty much evaporated the exact second it lost its military dominance, Athens lives on. Its focus on culture, equality, and comradeship built an intellectual heritage that has outlasted its actual empire by thousands of years.
Which brings us to Section 4, the fabric of society.
Okay, let's look at the actual population data, because it usually surprises people. Out of an estimated population of a few 100,000, the actual citizens, meaning the folks who held the real political power, made up only about a third of the population, just roughly 33%. Then you had a class called medics, basically resident foreigners, sitting at about 17%. They drove a ton of the commercial wealth but had virtually zero political rights. And then, making up the massive bulk of the entire population at a staggering 50%, was the slave class.
Now, the reality of Athenian slavery is going to sound really strange to us, because it was entirely different from the horrific chattel slavery of 19th century America. For instance, slaves were actually protected by law from physical assault by strangers. Some even lived totally apart from their masters, running their own private businesses and just kicking a portion of their income upstairs. But here's the wildest part. The state actually owned slaves who served as policemen, jailers, and even executioners. A huge chunk of the lower-level bureaucratic civil servants were state slaves. And because the actual citizen politicians only held office for a year at a time, these slave bureaucrats were effectively running the day-to-day public administration. So why does this matter so much for our philosophers? Because this massive labor force is exactly what freed up that 33% citizen class. It gave them the unbelievable amount of leisure time they needed to just sit in the city squares and engage in constant, high-level political and philosophical debate.
Let's dive deeper into that in Section 5, the meaning of citizenship.
Professor Charles Howard McGuane hit the nail on the head here. He said, "The state absorbed and included the entire collective activity of its citizens, a whole outside of which its members could not even be thought of, much less exist. Think about that for a second. It's a massive paradigm shift for us. To an Athenian, social life and political life were the exact same thing. There was absolutely no separation between the two. None.
There is a huge divide between how they viewed citizenship and how we view it today. Today, our relationship with the government is, well, pretty impersonal. We think in terms of having rights that protect us from the state. We insist on a really rigid separation of church and state. But an Athenian citizen, they didn't think about having rights against the state, because they were the state. There was this profound sense of total belonging. Their gods were the state's gods. Their religion was basically a ceremonial affirmation of their membership in that community. There was zero division of loyalty. They accepted the state's incredible regulatory power over their lives simply because they were the active agents wielding that power.
And finally, Section 6, the philosopher's crucible.
So what makes a good ruler? What exactly is a just society? When Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were agonizing over these massive questions, they were reacting directly to everything we just talked about. It was this highly specific environment, a geographically isolated, incredibly intimate, yet demographically unequal society where politics literally consumed your entire existence that forced these men to grapple with the heavy concepts of justice, authority, and freedom. The enduring foundational texts they left us are direct reflections of the intense crucible of the Greek polis.
To wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative question to chew on. How is our own modern environment currently shaping our political ideologies? If the great Greek philosophers were products of their intimate, slave-supported, tightly knit city-states, how are our massive, heavily industrialized, wonderfully diverse, yet highly impersonal modern nation-states invisibly programming the political beliefs that we hold as absolute truths today? It's really something to think about, isn't it? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.